feeling that all over the world people have become dissatisfied with the sterile, dry, and frankly meaningless answers to the great mysteries of life that are given by science and by history. More and more people, and I would say it runs into tens and perhaps even hundreds of millions around the world, are increasingly aware that we're a much more mysterious species than we give ourselves credit for, and that there are many more mysteries and secrets in our past than we are prepared to accept at the moment. And this intuitive sense that people have is driving them to re-examine the past of the human race. Whether or not the historians and the scientists want to do it, the people themselves are leading the way in this quest for the truth about our own past. What's happening here is that intelligent people, ordinary members of the general public, who should never be underestimated, are themselves completely dissatisfied with the picture of the past that is being given to them. More and more evidence is coming out, and very gradually, very slowly, but very surely, this evidence is beginning to overwhelm the old historical model that we've been living with. Now, it's natural enough that those who have a vested interest in the existing historical model, for example, historians, Egyptologists, archaeologists, are going to be extremely reluctant to let it go, because they're blowing away their own careers when they do that. And this is why the move in this direction is coming from the general public, who are seeing the new evidence, who are putting two and two together and realizing that the answers are not provided by orthodox history, and who are actively seeking for an answer to the whole problem. I would say that it's most important of all to question authority. Actually, it's very clear. If we look at the history of science, even within recorded history, we can see that the great advances in science have always been made against a background of enormous resistance from the quote-unquote establishment. If we just blindly accept what the so-called authorities tell us, then we'll never make any kind of progress in ideas. It's essential to keep an open mind to all possibilities and not to be bound down by theories and ideas put forward by an entrenched establishment who have a vested interest in those very theories and ideas. I wrote Fingerprints of the Gods because I wasn't satisfied with the answers that were being given to me to a huge series of mysteries around this planet. Most mysterious of all, a series of ancient sites that have never been properly explained by historians. These sites I think of literally as the fingerprints of the gods, as marks left on our planet by a lost civilization that we have not yet properly identified. And amongst those sites, two in particular are extremely interesting. One is Giza in Egypt, where the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx stand. And on the other side of the Atlantic, on the other side of the world, is Tiwanaku in the high Andes in Bolivia. Possibly the oldest city ever been built, the oldest city surviving to this day. Archaeologists tell us that Tiwanaku dates to just 500 AD. On what is this theory based? It's based on the carbon dating of organic artifacts found buried around the gigantic stones out of which Tiwanaku is built. That's like saying that we can date Westminster Cathedral in London, which was built hundreds of years ago, on the basis of somebody buried in it 10 years ago. It's completely illogical. Tiwanaku is an extraordinary site. It's built of gigantic blocks of stone, which in some cases weigh more than 400 tons each. It's astronomically aligned with enormous precision. And when we do the astronomical calculations on Tiwanaku, we find that what those alignments are telling us is that this city was laid out 15,000 years ago, at least 15,000 years ago. And that also ties in with the geology of the site, because it's very clear, and even Orthodox archaeologists don't dispute this, that Tiwanaku was built as a port on the shores of Lake Titicaca. Now, Lake Titicaca today is almost 15 miles away from Tiwanaku and more than 100 feet lower. Of course, different lakes lose their water level at different rates, but I've talked to experts from the British Geological Survey who are working in that area at the moment, and they tell me that for Lake Titicaca to have declined as much as it has from the edge of the city of Tiwanaku would have taken, at the very least, 10,000 years to happen. So it seems sometimes that the geologists and the archaeologists don't compare notes on these problems, and perhaps if they did, we'd begin to get a better idea of what really went on in our own past. Situated at an altitude of 12,500 feet above sea level, Tiwanaku in the high Andes in Bolivia is one of the strangest and most mysterious sites in the world. A site that may have been very wrongly dated by conventional archaeologists working in that area. Round about the turn of the century, a great Bolivian scholar called Arthur Poznański, a professor at La Paz University, began a 50-year study of the ruins of Tiwanaku. Year in, year out, no matter what the conditions, no matter what the weather, Poznański was up there, excavating, measuring, carefully calculating the alignments of the site. And as a result of that 50 years of work, he came up with an extraordinary conclusion. He concluded on the basis of astronomical alignments that Tiwanaku had been laid out more than 15,000 years ago, long before any civilization known to history is ever supposed to have existed. When the Spanish first arrived in South America, they asked the local people, the Incas at that time, who built this incredible city of Tiwanaku with these gigantic blocks of stone? Did you build it? The Incas said no. In fact, they laughed at the idea. They said, we had nothing to do with this. This was built thousands of years before our time. It was built, they said, by gods or demigods, who they called the Viracochas, bearded, pale-skinned men who came from across the seas, they said, in a time of darkness and turmoil, when civilization had been destroyed, to restore the health of society, to bring back culture to a devastated land. And all the legends and traditions state that it was these mysterious bearded strangers, long ages ago, who built the city of Tiwanaku. The best bet is that the powerful statue, the middle of the three pillars in the subterranean temple in Tiwanaku, is an image of this bearded civilizing hero, Viracocha. Certainly the beard is very evident on the face, and the features of the face in no way resemble the features of a native of that area. He looks like a foreigner, and in fact, so much was he remembered to have looked like a foreigner that when the Spanish first arrived in South America, bearded, pale-skinned, coming from across the sea by boat, exactly as Viracocha was said to have come in all the legends, the local people at first welcomed the Spaniards, believing that they were the gods returning. But unlike the Viracochas, who brought only good things with them and who tried to create civilization and a prosperous and worthwhile society, the bearded Spaniards who came to South America destroyed everything that they found in their way. They obliterated almost all traces of the ancient civilizations that had lived in that area. They wiped clean one of the memory banks of mankind.
Is the upper statue also Viracocha?
It's been speculated that the statue on the side of the Gateway of the Sun also represents Viracocha. All of this is speculation because we have no records coming down to us from this period. But it is a great mystery to find on these extraordinarily ancient monuments the images of a type of people who should not have been present, according to conventional history, in the Americas at that time.
Well, who was Viracocha and where did he come from?
My own view is that Viracocha was one of the survivors of a great lost civilization of high antiquity that was destroyed in an enormous global cataclysm. I think there were a number of survivors, and all around the world we find memories of people like him tall, bearded people. Quetzalcoatl in Mexico is another example. Osiris in Egypt is another example. I've made a very close study of the symbolism of all of these figures, and they have a remarkable amount in common, much more than can be explained by coincidence. I think what we're looking at here are very ancient memories of a people from a civilization as yet unidentified by history, who sought to keep the light of knowledge burning in a devastated world. It's long been noticed that there are curious similarities between the very ancient historical cultures of Mexico, of the Andes, and of Egypt, and other places around the world as well, quite distant and scattered places. And it's been suggested from time to time that maybe these have resulted from some kind of direct influence of Egypt on Mexico, or of South America on Egypt, or so on and so forth. My own view is that what we're looking at here is a common influence that touched all of these places long before recorded history began. A remote third-party civilization unidentified by historians that had a presence in Mexico, that had a presence in South America, that had a presence in Egypt and elsewhere, and that left behind a legacy of knowledge in all of those places. That legacy was then reinterpreted and developed and used in different ways by the different peoples, but still, even to this day, we find those common elements, and I think they all go back to a common source. There are so many strange similarities linking ancient Egypt, ancient South America, ancient Central America as well. One of the best examples is the kind of stonework that was used, very large blocks of stone put together with extraordinary complexity in very finely built walls with joints so precisely aligned that you can't even slip a piece of paper into those joints today. This architecture looks very similar in the different parts of the world, and yet there's supposed to have been no contact between these ancient civilizations. It seems to me that the answer to this problem lies in an even more ancient civilization, which passed down a legacy of architectural knowledge to all these widely scattered areas of the globe. And it's that common legacy that explains the common points and similarities better than any other theory that I've come across. What I think of as one of the architectural fingerprints of the gods is a certain way of working with stone. For example, carrying blocks around a corner in an L shape is a very extraordinary way of building, and we find this, for example, in the Valley Temple next door to the Sphinx at Giza, and we find it in pre-Inca architecture all over the Andes in South America. To me, the best explanation for this common method of building, and very unusual method of building on both sides of the Atlantic, is that it's the result of a common architectural legacy handed on to both of these areas by a remote civilization not yet identified by history. And what I see in that architecture is the architecture of cataclysm. This seems to have been an architecture that was designed to withstand the most horrendous geological shocks, huge earthquakes, disasters of that kind. This type of architecture is capable of riding out the worst earthquake that you can imagine. So it seems to have been devised by a people who needed to deal with very bad earthquakes. And we find that architecture in Egypt and in South America still surviving to this day. It's pretty clear to me from the evidence that a common legacy of architectural knowledge was passed down from remote prehistory and spread out in very widely scattered locations around the world. And what all this architecture has in common is enormous stability. I think of it as the architecture of cataclysm, architecture that was created by a people who had passed through an enormous disaster and who had survived that disaster, a great movement of the earth, as all the legends say, who wanted to build monuments that could never be destroyed by no matter how great the earthquake was. And also a people who had a fixation with predicting when such a cataclysm might occur again, and who seemed to have looked to the skies and to the stars to find a way of calculating when the next disaster would occur. Ask yourself this: if you belonged to a high civilization that had just been almost completely obliterated by a gigantic geological cataclysm, a movement of the crust of the earth. What would you set out to do in the future? First of all, you would set out to create buildings that were extremely stable, that would survive the worst imaginable earthquake. And that's what we find in these fingerprints of a lost architectural knowledge all around the world. A fixation, a desire to create buildings that would last forever, no matter what happened to them. And another thing that we find is a focus on trying to predict when the cataclysm will recur. What has come down to us from the ancient past seems to be a message that by a close study of astronomical phenomena, it is possible to predict when the Earth will again be visited by this all-destroying cataclysm. And the eeriest thing of all is that there's a convergence of ancient mythology from all around the world. The best known example is the Mayan calendar from Central America, which tells us very precisely that there's going to be another great movement of the Earth on the 23rd of December in 2012 AD in our calendar. All of this based on very careful astronomical observations. Now, I'm not saying that the ancient myths are right. What I am saying is that we would be stupid if we didn't at least listen to this testimony that has been passed down to us from a remote time, and a testimony that bears the fingerprints of scientific thinkers, not primitive savages. The prime meridian at Greenwich is measured with the latest modern techniques, and beside the meridian line there stands a meridian building, which is oriented north, south, east and west. The interesting thing about this building, although it incorporates all the latest knowledge, is that it is in fact 9/60ths of a degree off true north. And that's about the best we can do with our culture. But if you go to Egypt and go to the Great Pyramid, which is not just any little building, which is a 6 million ton building, and which is at the very least 4,500 years old, and perhaps much older, you find that it is just 3/60ths of a degree off true north. Now, what this tells us is that the people who built the Great Pyramid were people with advanced scientific knowledge, with the ability to express that knowledge with incredible precision in the most remarkable monument that has ever been built on the face of this earth. We're told by Egyptologists that that monument, perfectly oriented due north, south, east and west, was built simply to satisfy the ego of some pharaoh of the 4th dynasty as his tomb. Everything about the monument proclaims the opposite conclusion, that it could never have been a tomb, and that whatever its purpose and function is, it was not to satisfy the ego of an individual pharaoh, whose name is not even inscribed upon it in any place. This is a work of science and intelligence left for future generations to puzzle out. Not only is it perfectly oriented to the north, it also stands on latitude 30, exactly 1/3 of the way between the North Pole and the equator. Again, the Egyptologists would like us to believe that this is the result of coincidence. I think this defies common sense, and more people are unwilling to accept such an idea about the Great Pyramid. If it stands on latitude 30, then it does so because its builders deliberately put it there. For several hundred years, a model of what mankind is and of what the Earth is has been steadily building up, I would say since the Renaissance and perhaps even before. And this is the prevailing model that we live with today. Academic specialists, whether they're scientists, physicists, geologists, Egyptologists working in the realm of history, archaeologists, all have a vested intellectual interest in the existing model, because that is what their careers are based on. They've grown up with that model. They took it in with their mother's milk. They themselves teach it in universities to other students. For such people, human nature being what it is, it's very easy to understand why they find it extremely difficult to deal with evidence which contradicts that model in which they have such a strong personal investment. And it's natural that they should seek to ignore or discount or even ridicule that evidence. But we're getting to a situation now where the evidence is piling up and piling up and piling up, and the old model is becoming increasingly untenable. The great challenge for the future is for people to open their minds again to all possibilities and not to desperately defend a view of the past that just doesn't work anymore. But I'm afraid the last people who are going to be prepared to open their minds to that possibility are the scientists and the historians who are tied in to the existing model. What I sense, particularly with Egyptologists, is a kind of desperation or fear. They themselves can't be completely blind to the new evidence that's coming up that contradicts the model that they've been working with. But they realize that if they admit even one tiny point of that new evidence, that's going to be the thin end of the wedge which is going to overturn the whole model on which their careers are based, and also their whole idea of what the past of mankind is. It's extremely difficult psychologically for anybody to accept such a revolutionary overturn of everything that they hold to be true, and it's natural that they should resist as strongly as possible the new ideas that are coming up. But these aren't just ideas. This is evidence. Evidence from all over the world which casts doubt on the old model. And that's why people are increasingly turning away from the orthodox authorities and reading books like Fingerprints of the Gods to find answers to the mysteries that puzzle them as well. The model of the old world and the new world is deeply rooted in the conventional historical view that America was discovered in 1492 by people from Europe, and that's when its history begins, although of course we know that the Americas were inhabited for long periods before that. But what nobody has ever considered is the possibility that there may have been an earlier world altogether, a civilization on this planet way before what we call history began, in that deep, dark period called prehistory, from which no records have come down. A civilization that knew the world as well as we do ourselves, and which did not divide it into categories of old and new, but that left its traces everywhere for us to rediscover today. I am convinced by the evidence that we are a species with amnesia. We have forgotten something of great importance from our own past. And I think in that terrible forgetfulness, we may find the explanation for why we're so confused, so disturbed, so mixed up, so lacking in direction as we face the coming millennium. There's a real sense of disorientation spreading around the world. And I think the only way that we're going to overcome that is to recover this incredibly important episode from our own past that we've kind of blanked out and forgotten. When we recover it, we'll realize for a start that our civilization isn't the apex of creation. It isn't the pinnacle towards which everything has been building throughout all of geological time. Rather, it's part of an up and down, a flow in history that goes on, of civilizations, that it's possible for a civilization to reach a very high level of advancement and be wiped out. This is something we've never really confronted, and we need to confront it, that a great civilization of the past was so completely destroyed that almost no traces of it are left. The same thing could happen to us. This knowledge should teach us humility. I think what has happened, and it's a process that's taken hundreds of years to come to fruition, is a growing dissatisfaction with all the old answers that have been given to us. conventional religion no longer works. It doesn't provide us with the explanations we need to make sense of what we see going on around us. Science doesn't give us any meaning in our lives at all. It wants to reduce everything to accidental collections of molecules. There's a profound dissatisfaction with that, and a strong feeling that there must be something more, and people are searching for this. History doesn't give us the answer either. It envisages a straightforward, linear evolution of society from primitive to advanced today, and yet all of us grew up in our childhood hearing the myths and legends of the Golden Age, and we have a sense that there may be truth in those myths and legends, a truth that history just hasn't come to terms with at all.